Today I'll be doing Oregon. So first I will be going through their roster, and then I'll go through their schedule game by game and give you a predicted winner and loser for each game. Oregon's roster this year is elite. They're loaded and they have no weaknesses. They're good everywhere. I actually think that they have a real chance to win the national title this year. They're one of only five teams that I think has a real chance to do that this year. Uh, and first, I'm going to talk a little bit about Oregon's head coach, Dan Lanning. Uh, so, uh, mm, I had Dan Lanning ranked number 9 on my top 10 coaches list for this season. But I think he has a higher ceiling as a coach than most of those coaches that I had ranked ahead of him. I just had him at, at 9 because he's only been a head coach for 2 years. But I think he's the definition of what a great college football coach is. He's like Nick Saban and Kirby Smart in the way that he's a defensive coach, uh, but uh, he knows that you need to be good on both sides of the ball, and Oregon was last year, and that he understands like Saban and Smart do that uh, the line of scrimmage is very important, and you have to have really good lines. And he's a great recruiter. Oregon just had the number 3 recruiting class in the country this year, and the best recruiting class that Oregon has ever had. That included a 5-star linebacker, a 5-star wide receiver, two 4-star defensive backs, uh, 3 4-star defensive linemen, and a 4-star offensive lineman. And Lanning is also great at player development. Bo Nix is a perfect example of that. He came to Oregon from Auburn as an average quarterback at best, and then left there as a number 1 NFL draft pick from Lanning's coaching. And he also understands that you do need to use the portal to fill holes that where you need players from the portal and Oregon had one of the best groups of transfers this year. Uh, mm, on Oregon's roster, starting on offense, so at quarterback, I've talked about in my Alabama and Georgia videos, Jalen Milroe and Carson Beck, who I think are going to be two of the best quarterbacks in the country this year. And I talked about their weaknesses. Carson Beck's weaknesses not being very good under pressure, and then Milroe's is not being able to read defenses very well. But with Dylan Gabriel, he has no weaknesses. That's why I think he's the best quarterback in the country this year. Uh, he's really good at pressure. He knows how to make plays when under pressure, and he is very accurate in the pocket, and he knows how to read defenses, and he can also run around when he needs to, and he also throws a great deep ball. And then Lanning also brought in a 5-star quarterback Dante Moore from UCLA, who will be the backup this year and probably their starter in 2025. And at wide receiver, they do lose their top wide receiver Franklin, who was really good, but they still have Tez Johnson, who is one of the best receivers in America. He's a top 5 wide receiver. He had last year 86 catches for 1,182 yards, 10 touchdowns, and averaged 13.7 yards a catch, and had 4 games of over 100 yards. And they've got Holden from Alabama. He transferred into Oregon last season from Alabama. who only started 2 games last year, but added 37 catches for 452 yards, 6 touchdowns, and averaged 12.2 yards a catch. I think he'll have a big year this year. And then they added in a really good wide receiver from Texas A&M, Evan Stewart, to make up for losing their top wide receiver, uh, who in 18 games at Texas A&M had 91 catches, 1,161 yards, 6 touchdowns, and averaged 12.8 yards per catch. And then they've also got Gary Bryant, who made 12 starts last year and had 30 catches for 442 and 4 touchdowns, averaging 14.7 yards a catch. He'll probably have bigger numbers this year. So they're loaded at wide receiver. I think this is the best wide receiver unit in the country. And then they've got Terrence Ferguson coming back at tight end, who is good. I think he'll be one of the best tight ends in the country this year. He had last year 42 catches for 414 yards, 6 touchdowns, averaging 9.9 a catch. And at running back, they do lose their best running back, but Jordan James had a really good freshman season as a backup last year, rushing for 759 yards and 11 touchdowns, averaging 7.1 yards per carry. And then they also have Noah Whittington, who didn't play much last year because of an injury, but until 2022, as a backup running back, had 781 yards and 5 touchdowns, averaging 5.6 yards a carry. So that's a nice running back group there with James and Whittington. And on the offensive line, they returned 3 starters from an elite offensive line that allowed the fewest sacks in the country last year. Only 5 all season they allowed. They get back 2 of the best tackles in the country, Johnny Cornelius and Josh Connerly. Cornelius only allowed 11 pressures last year and didn't allow any sacks, and then Connerly only allowed 1 sack and 17 pressures last season. And then they returned one of the best guards in the country, Marcus Harper, who didn't allow any sacks and only allowed 6 pressures last year. And then they bring in a really good offensive lineman from Indiana that will be the other starting guard, Matthew Bedford, who only allowed 2 sacks and 15 pressures last year as a starter at Indiana. And then the starting center they do lose from last year, who was really good, but they have a Panoa Lalula taking over, who played 413 snaps last year, and didn't allow any sacks and only allowed 2 pressures. So this is going to be a top 3 offensive line in the country. And on the defensive side, I think Oregon will be running the 4-2-5 defense a lot this year because they have 5 really good defensive backs. But on the defensive line, they return Jordan Birch, who last season had 34 tackles and 3 sacks and 29 total pressures. He's really good. And then Lanning brought in 2 really good defensive linemen from the transfer portal. He brought in Jamari Caldwell from Houston, who in 11 games and 0 starts last year had 27 tackles and 6.5 sacks and 15 total pressures. And he brought in Derek Carmen from Michigan State, who had in 12 games last year, 40 tackles, 1.5 sacks, a forced fumble, and 4 total pressures. And then The other starter on the defensive line is expected to be uh, Mateo Uyangale, who is a five-star recruit who, as a freshman last season, didn't start any games but played in every game and looked good, having 18 tackles, uh, two sacks, two pass breakups, and 12 total pressures. This is going to be an elite defensive line. And then at linebacker, they return their best one of the best in the country, Jeffrey Bossa, who had 71 tackles and 27 total pressures and a pick six last year. Uh, and they've also got the talented Justin Jacobs, who only played 8 games last year because of an injury, but had 32 tackles, sack, and five total pressures. And in the secondary, this was the biggest weakness of Oregon's defense last year. Their secondary struggled against Michael Penix, and that's why they lost those games both times against Washington. Uh, but I think Lanning has fixed that with the portal. He brought in three really good cornerbacks. He brought in Jabbar Muhammad from Washington, a really good cornerback who had 46 tackles, two sacks, three interceptions, a fumble recovery, and 14 pass breakups last season. And he also brought in Brandon Johnson from Duke, who had in 2 years at Duke 111 tackles, seven and a half sacks, two forced fumbles and two fumble recoveries, and two interceptions and 11 pass breakups. And he brought in Cam Alexander from UTSA, who last season had 34 tackles, a sack, two interceptions, and 15 pass breakups. And then at safety, they returned their top one, Ty Sheem Johnson, who had 70 tackles, seven pass breakups, two interceptions, and a sack last season. And they bring in a really good safety from Kansas State, Colby Savage, who in 22 games there had 115 tackles, six interceptions also. Uh, so this will be one of the best secondaries in the country. And then on special teams, they returned their punter and lose their kicker, but they brought in a really good kicker from Oregon State who led the Pac-12 in field goal percentage, making 13 out of 14 field goals. And 5 out of 6 from 40 to 49 yards. So they should be in pretty good shape on special teams too. So now moving on to the prediction. So they start the season against Idaho, which will be a very easy win. Uh, Oregon will probably score like 70 points in this game, and they may shut out Idaho. And then they play Boise State, one of the best group of five teams, but they're no match for Oregon. I think this will be a big blowout win for Oregon. And then they play Oregon State in the rivalry. And even though this one's on the road, Oregon State's not going to be any good this year. I don't think this will be close at all. I think Oregon wins big in a blowout. And then they play UCLA on the road also. But UCLA is not going to be very good either this year, I don't think, with all the changes with them. I think this will be a blowout win for Oregon, too. Uh, and then they play Michigan State. Michigan State's not going to be ready to compete with a team like Oregon. This will be a blowout, too. So now there is no reason why Oregon shouldn't be 5-0 for the big game against Ohio State. So for this game, both teams are pretty even to me. Ohio State, I think, has a little bit of an advantage on the defensive line, and then Oregon, I think, has a little bit of an advantage on the offensive line. And I think Ohio State's secondary is a little bit better than Oregon's, but it's close. And I do like Dylan Gabriel better than Will Howard as a quarterback, and I like Oregon's receivers better. But I like Ohio State's running backs a little bit better. I'm just going to take the home team in this one. So I think Oregon beats Ohio State. Mm, so now they will be playing Purdue, a horrible team that they will destroy by probably 40 something points. And then they play Illinois, another horrible team that they'll destroy no problem by probably 40 something. And then they play Michigan on the road. This one will be pretty tough. Michigan's defense will match up well with Oregon's, but the problem is Michigan's offense is going to be no match for Oregon's. Oregon's is going to be so much better than Michigan's. They're better on the offensive line and much better at quarterback. And I think overall they've got a better running back unit, even though their running backs may not be quite as good as Donovan Edwards. And then Oregon has much better wide receivers. And Oregon, I actually think, probably has a better secondary than Michigan does this year. I do think Michigan's defense will keep them in this game, but I do think Oregon ends up winning this one by about 10. Uh, and then they play Maryland, a team that losing that quarterback is not going to be the same this year. I don't think they're going to be very good at all. I think Oregon blows them out. Mm, and then on the road at Wisconsin. So I've looked at Wisconsin's roster some, and their offensive line matches up pretty well with Oregon's defensive line, but their defensive line does not match up well at all with Oregon's offensive line. So I think Oregon's offensive line will push them around, and Oregon will be able to run the ball in this game. And Oregon may not be able to throw quite as much as they will in most of their games on Wisconsin because Wisconsin, I think, is going to have a pretty good secondary. But Wisconsin just does not have the playmakers on offense that uh, Oregon has at quarterback, running back, and wide receiver. I think that Wisconsin will fight with this game being at Wisconsin, but I think Oregon does end up winning this one by around 14. And then it comes time for the rivalry game with Washington, the team that kept Oregon out of the college football playoff last year. And I do think the rivalry will keep this game from being a blowout. I think it'll be somewhat competitive, but Oregon this year has just got so much better of a roster than Washington does. And I think they win this game by around 2 touchdowns. So my final prediction for Oregon is 12-0 overall, and then 9-0 in the conference. So that will for sure put them in the Big Ten championship, and for sure in the college football playoff, whether if they win it or lose it. Uh, mm, but that will be it with this video. And thanks for watching, and please subscribe, and I'll be back soon.